He found the letter at 3 in the morning. She had offered to trade herself for his land, his parents' land, the land where their graves lay under frozen ground. He tore it to pieces and let the fragments fall like snow. "We face this together," he said, "or not at all." But she had not told him everything, and what the quilt remembered would change it all. This is the story of how a woman with nothing walked into a house of 4 mounted men and turned it into a home. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just 4 bearded mountain men standing shoulder to shoulder on a wooden platform in 100 miles of wilderness stretching in every direction like a promise nobody intended to keep. The letter had said a home. The letter had said partnership and marriage and a new beginning in the Montana Territory. What the letter had not said was that 4 of the largest human beings Clara Ashford had ever seen would be standing on that platform like a wall of sun-bronzed granite, collectively representing over 26 feet of frontier masculinity for which no amount of imagination could have prepared a woman of 5 feet 3 inches and 100 pounds from Boston, Massachusetts. She clutched the wicker basket in her left hand. The carpet bag hung from her right. Everything she owned in this world was divided between those 2 containers, and the wicker basket held the only things that mattered: a few books, a pressed flower album, drawing supplies, and a quilt. An unfinished quilt of dark blues and grays, somber and beautiful, made by her mother's hands for a father who would never come home. But Clara did not know the secret hidden in that quilt. Not yet, and when she discovered it, everything would change. The dust of Redstone Crossing had the color of old blood, a fine reddish powder that crept into everything. It settled on the warped clapboard storefronts, on the cracked leather of saddles baking in the afternoon sun, and on the broad, anxious shoulders of the 4 men who stood watching her as though she were a verdict being delivered. Spring of 1878. The Montana Territory was still a place where the land had not yet decided whether it would tolerate the presence of men. Mountains rose in every direction, impossibly vast, their peaks still crowned with the last stubborn snow of winter. The sky overhead was so wide and so blue, it made a person feel either free or terribly, irreversibly small. Most days the Crawford brothers felt both. They had been standing on that platform for the better part of an hour, though none of them would admit to arriving early. The stagecoach from the railhead at Bozeman was due before noon, and the clock above the land office already showed 1/4 past. Otis Drummond, the driver, was famous for 2 things: chewing tobacco with the dedication of a man performing sacred ritual, and never once arriving on schedule. Stone Crawford stood at the front of the group, slightly ahead of his brothers, the way he always stood, slightly ahead, slightly between them and whatever was coming. It was not a conscious choice. It was simply the architecture of his life, built by necessity and hardened by 6 years of standing exactly there between his family and every storm the world had thrown at them. He was 30 years old, though the land had carved him into something that looked both older and more permanent. 6 feet 6 inches tall, shoulders that could block a doorway, hands that had split more fence rails than he could count. His face was the kind that women in dime novels would call handsome, but in person it was something more complicated than handsome. It was a landscape. The sun had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Wind and worry had done the rest. His jaw was square and perpetually set as though he were clenching against some invisible pain. And his eyes, deep amber, the color of whiskey held up to firelight, carried a weight that had nothing to do with his physical size. A man keeps his word. Stone said that to each of his brothers when they were old enough to understand. It was what their father had said, and Stone kept every word he ever gave, even the ones nobody asked him to give, even the promise whispered in the dark on a January night, kneeling beside 2 fresh graves in frozen ground, that he would not let this family fall apart. Even the promise he made to himself that he would never let anyone, not a single soul, get close enough to lose again. That was the only promise he would break. But he did not know that yet. 6 years ago, his parents had died. January in Montana. The kind of cold that turned the air into something solid and sharp. A living thing that cut through clothing, through skin, through bone. The kind of cold that made metal brittle as glass, froze water in the bucket before you could carry it to the barn, and crystallized your breath into frost on your eyelashes. His father and mother had been returning from town in the wagon when the blizzard hit. Stone had been in Redstone Crossing that same day, buying medicine for a sick calf. He was 19 miles away when the snow buried them. He found the wagon the next morning, had to dig through 3 feet of snow to reach it. The horses were frozen in their traces, eyes open, coated in rime like statues of themselves. His mother's hand was still gripping his father's arm, frozen in a final gesture of love. They had died together, which was perhaps a mercy. But Stone had not been there. 19 miles. 1 hour's ride in normal weather. A distance impossible to cross in a Montana blizzard, but close enough to haunt a man for the rest of his life. He dug the graves by hand. The ground was frozen so hard the pickaxe bounced back. He had to burn fires on the surface all night long to soften the earth enough to dig. Wyatt, 14 years old, stood beside him, holding a lantern, his face white as chalk, not crying because the tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. Garrett and Colton took turns with the shovel. 4 brothers. 2 graves, the longest night of their lives. Stone had been 24. Garrett 21. Colton 19. Wyatt just 14. A boy. Stone buried his parents in the hard ground behind the ranch house. He placed 2 stones he had carved himself with a chisel and a hammer, the letters rough but deep cut into rock that would outlast all of them. Then he became the thing he had never planned to be. The father, the provider, the law, and the wall between his brothers and a world that wanted to swallow them whole. He had held the ranch together through drought, when the creek ran so low the cattle had to walk 2 miles to the nearest water, and Stone woke at 4 in the morning to drive the herd to drink before the sun turned the water to vapor. Through debt, when banker Pritchard sat in his office, the only brick building in town, and therefore the object of considerable local pride, and shook his head slowly, and Stone had to swallow his self-respect to ask for more time. Through one particularly bad winter, when they ate nothing but elk jerky and boiled oats for 6 weeks straight, when Wyatt was 16 and still growing, and Stone cut his own portion smaller so the youngest could have more. He had kept his brothers fed, kept the cattle alive, kept the mortgage paid more or less, and in doing so he had slowly, methodically, without even noticing, stopped being a young man and become something harder, something lonelier. Granite is not born, it is forged. Each winter another layer, each sleepless night of worry another layer. Each silent meal around a table of 4 men who did not know how to talk about anything beyond cattle and fences, another layer still. Winter always ends. Stone said that too. But 6 winters in the winter inside him had not. Every day he rose before dawn, split wood, the rhythm of the axe steady as a clock, the smell of fresh pine in the cold morning air. Checked the fences, wire posts, hinges. He used bare hands because gloves blocked feeling, and feeling told him which posts were about to give, fed the cattle, counted every head, knew the name of every calf, mended harness with a leather needle and wax thread, his fingers performing work of painstaking precision that contradicted hands large enough to crush an apple. He could fix nearly anything by hand, a windmill, a horse stall, a roof torn by wind, skills not learned from books, but from necessity. From the understanding that if he did not fix it, nobody would, from 6 years of being the only person standing between his family and collapse. That was Stone Crawford, 30 years old, 6 feet 6, 240 pounds, the biggest man in the territory and the loneliest soul in the valley. A man who had spent half a decade building walls so tall and so thick that he had forgotten there was a person behind them. Behind him on the platform, Garrett Crawford leaned against a post with a book tucked under his arm. 27, the second born, the one the family called the Thinker, a title that in Montana was not always a compliment. He was tall, 6'4", built strong enough to swing an axe for 8 hours without complaint. But there was something in the way he moved, a deliberateness, a quiet precision that set him apart. His hands were equally comfortable holding a book or a branding iron. He had taught himself to read law from borrowed books and territorial statutes, not because he wanted to be a lawyer, but because he believed that knowledge was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. Actions, not words. But Garrett believed that sometimes the right words placed at the right moment carried more force than any action. Colton Crawford, 25, shifted his weight from one foot to the other with the restless energy of a man who found stillness physically uncomfortable. He was the third brother. If Stone was the wall and Garrett was the mind, Colton was the blade. Quick, sharp, slightly dangerous. He had his mother's lighter coloring, brown hair shot through with sun-bleached gold, and eyes that held a perpetual flicker of mischief, as though he were always in on a joke the rest of the world had not yet heard. He was the charmer, the talker, the one who could walk into a saloon full of strangers and walk out with three new friends and someone else's pocket watch. He played poker with a skill that bordered on artistry and had once talked a cattle rustler into returning a stolen horse by convincing the man that the horse was cursed. Beneath the bravado, Colton was the most observant of the four brothers. He read people the way Garrett read books, quickly and with an eye for what lay beneath the surface. A skill learned at poker tables and perfected in the hard school of frontier survival. Very little escaped his notice. And then there was Wyatt, 20 years old, and the territory had not yet managed to knock the shine off him. He was the youngest the baby, though at 6'3" and still growing, he was no one's idea of a child. He had a face that was still open, still capable of unguarded expressions of tone and wonder and hope, qualities that the Montana winter seemed designed to freeze out of a person. Wyatt had been 14 when his parents died, old enough to understand, young enough to be shattered. Stone had held the family together, but it was Wyatt in his quiet way who had given them a reason to hold it together. His optimism was not naive. It was a choice, a daily stubborn refusal to let the darkness win, and that made him in many ways the strongest of them all. It had been Stone's idea to place the advertisement in the matrimonial Times, not for romance. The word itself felt foolish in his mouth, like something that belonged to people who lived in houses with wallpaper and china cabinets. He needed a woman the way he needed a new plow or a stronger fence line. The ranch required skills he and his brothers did not possess. Cooking that would not slowly poison them. Mending that would keep clothes on their backs through winter. A garden that would produce something other than weeds. And if he was being honest, which he rarely was, about anything that truly mattered, the house needed something else entirely. Something he could not name but felt every evening when the four of them sat around the table in silence, eating bad food in a home that had not felt like a home in 6 years. The advertisement had been simple, practical, stripped of any poetry. Stone Crawford and Brothers, ranchers, Redstone Crossing, Montana Territory. Seek a woman of good character and strong constitution for marriage and partnership in a working cattle ranch. Must be willing to endure hard conditions and remote living. Garrett had read the draft and added in his careful hand, a woman of gentle temperament who appreciates the quiet things. Colton had laughed and added his own line, seeks a woman of lively spirit and good humor. Wyatt had just grinned and said, tell her we are not as bad as we sound. They had sent the letter in the train fare 3 months ago. One reply had come back. A Miss Clara Ashford of Boston, Massachusetts. Her letter had been brief, well-written, and almost entirely devoid of personal detail. She stated that she was 22, unmarried, capable in domestic arts, and seeking a new life in the West. She included no photograph. She asked no questions about the brothers' appearance, income, or temperament. Stone had read her letter 7 times, searching for the things she was not saying. He could feel it there between the carefully chosen words. The way you could feel a storm building behind the mountains hours before it broke. This woman was running from something. He did not know what, but he knew the handwriting of desperation because he had written in it himself. Wyatt saw it first. A faint plume rising against the blue, the unmistakable signature of the overland stage. Something tightened in Stone's chest. Not anticipation exactly, but something close to it. Something he had not felt in a very long time. All right, he said. His voice carried the deep, rough authority that his brothers had learned long ago not to argue with. Remember what we discussed. We are gentlemen. We help with her trunk. We do not stare. We do not say anything foolish. He looked directly at Colton. We do not try to be clever. I am never trying, Colton said with a grin. It comes naturally. Try smiling, Brother Wyatt added. It will not crack your face. Probably. Stone did not smile. He set his jaw and turned to watch the approaching dust cloud and tried very hard not to think about the fact that his heart was beating faster than it had in 6 years. The stagecoach came around the bend like a ship rounding a headland, all groaning wood and thundering hooves. A battered Concord coach, its red paint sun faded to the color of a bruised sunset, pulled by a team of 4 horses that looked as though they had strong opinions about their current employment. Otis Drummond sat on the box, one foot braced against the brake, a stream of tobacco juice arcing expertly into the wind. "Got a delivery for the Crawford boys," he bellowed, hauling the team to a shuddering halt in a spray of gravel and dust. "Handled with care, I would say." The door of the coach swung open, and time for Stone Crawford seemed to slow to a crawl. The woman who emerged was not what any of them had expected. She was small. That was the first thing that registered. Small in the way that a wren is small, delicate boned and finely made, as though assembled from materials more precious than common clay. She could not have been more than 5 feet 3 inches tall. Standing on the platform of the stagecoach office, surrounded by 4 men who collectively represented over 26 feet of frontier masculinity, she looked like a porcelain figurine placed accidentally on a shelf of cast iron. She had a heart-shaped face with skin so fair it seemed almost translucent in the afternoon light, showing the faintest tracery of blue veins at her temples. Her eyes were large, a deep cornflower blue that held a dozen emotions at once: wonder and fear and intelligence, and a desperate, carefully hidden hope. Her hair was honey blonde, pulled back in a modest arrangement that was losing its battle with the wind. Soft tendrils escaping to frame her face and catch the sunlight like threads of spun gold. She wore a traveling dress of navy blue. A good dress, well made from quality fabric with small lace details at the collar and cuffs. But Stone's practical eye noticed what a less observant man might miss. The dress was slightly worn at the elbows. The lace had been mended carefully but visibly at one point, and though it was a fine cut, it was the only fine thing about her. Her carpet bag was battered, her shoes were scuffed. She wore a single piece of jewelry, a small cameo brooch at her throat that she touched unconsciously, the way a person touches a talisman. She was beautiful. That fact struck Stone like a physical blow. Unexpected and unwelcome. But she was also unmistakably terrified. She stood on the step of the coach, clutching her carpet bag in one hand and the battered wicker basket in the other, and she looked at the 4 Crawford brothers the way a person looks at the edge of a very high cliff. Wyatt moved first. He stepped forward with the natural, unself-conscious friendliness that was his gift and extended his hand. "Miss Ashford, welcome to Redstone Crossing. I am Wyatt Crawford. We are real glad you are here." His smile was so genuine, so plainly delighted, that something in her face softened. She took his hand. Stone noticed that her fingers were trembling. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford," just Wyatt, the youngest brother, corrected, beaming. Colton stepped forward next, doffing his hat with an exaggerated flourish. "Colton Crawford, ma'am, the handsome one. You will figure out which one that is soon enough." "The modest one," clearly, Garrett said dryly, extending his own hand. "I am Garrett. It is a pleasure, Miss Ashford." And then it was Stone's turn. He stepped forward and looked down at her. She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The motion exposed the slender column of her throat and the delicate cameo brooch, and the pulse that beat visibly beneath her jaw. Her eyes, that impossible blue, searched his face with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment. She was reading him, trying to determine if she had made a terrible mistake. He extended his hand. "Miss Ashford, I am Stone Crawford." Her hand disappeared inside his. It was like holding a sparrow. Small, warm, trembling slightly. "Mr. Crawford, thank you for the ticket." It was the arrangement, he replied, and immediately wished he had said something less cold, less transactional, but he did not know how to say what he actually felt, which was that the sight of her had reached inside his chest and rearranged something fundamental, and that the sensation was deeply, profoundly alarming. That was the first time in 6 years Stone Crawford had touched a woman, and the feeling of it, warm, fragile, alive, burned through his calluses like hot water through ice. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. 2 hours on a narrow wagon trail that wound through pine forests thick with ponderosa, their bark cracking into great plates like maps of undiscovered continents. The smell of fresh resin, sweet and sharp and clean, in a way that Boston air had never been. Through open meadows where the spring grass stood belly high on the horses waving in the wind, like a green ocean dotted with wildflowers in yellow and purple and white, as though someone had scattered seeds from the sky. Along ridgelines where the views opened up so suddenly, so spectacularly, that Clara gasped each time a new panorama revealed itself. Stone drove the wagon. Clara sat beside him on the bench. 18 inches of space between them that felt like a continent. The three younger brothers rode alongside on horseback, and in their different ways, each began the work of filling the silence. Wyatt rode close, pointing out landmarks with the eagerness of a tour guide who loved his territory with an almost religious devotion. That ridge up there is called Eagle Point. There is a family of red-tailed hawks that nest near the top. The little ones just learned to fly last month. You should see them, Miss Ashford. They are terrible at it. They fly about 10 feet and then crash into a tree, but they keep trying. Clara smiled, and the smile transformed her. It moved across her face like sunlight breaking through cloud cover, changing the geography of her features from guarded and weary to something luminous and warm. Wyatt, seeing this, sat up straighter in his saddle and very nearly rode his horse into a tree himself. The trail narrowed through a stand of lodgepole pines. As the wagon jolted over a root, a grouse exploded from the underbrush in a burst of feathers and indignant squawking. Clara gasped and flinched. Stone's arm shot out instinctively, his hand closing on her shoulder, firm and gentle, steadying her. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he pulled his hand back as though her shoulder had been made of hot iron. Neither of them spoke, but Clara touched the spot where his hand had rested, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly from fear to something else entirely. The Crawford Ranch sat in a high valley that was, even by Montana standards, spectacularly beautiful. The mountains ringed it like a crown, their slopes thick with pine and aspen, their peaks white against the sky so blue it looked painted. A creek cold and clear ran along the northern boundary. The meadows were just beginning to green with the first growth of spring. The ranch buildings were less inspiring. The main house was a large log structure, solidly built, chinked with mud and moss, but showing the wear of years without a woman's attention. The porch sagged on one end, a support post rotted through and never replaced because 4 brothers were always too busy with the things that kept them alive to worry about a sagging porch. The windows were clouded with grime so thick that the light entering the house had already dimmed, turning everything inside into a muted version of itself. A collection of barns, corrals, and sheds surrounded the house in various states of repair. The general impression was of a place being held together by stubbornness and hope in roughly equal measure. A place that was surviving but not living. A place where 4 men had been so focused on not dying that they had forgotten that living meant more than that. Home, Stone said. The word came out flatter than he intended. Flat because he heard himself say it and realized he was introducing a home he did not truly believe was one. Home. That word had lost its meaning 6 years ago, when the smell of his mother's cooking vanished from these walls for the last time. Clara looked at the house for a long moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag and her wicker basket. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, and she walked up the porch steps, choosing the side that did not sag, and through the front door as though she were walking into battle. Because that was exactly what Clara Ashford was doing, fighting a battle. Her battle was not fought with guns. It was fought with lye soap, with flour, with needle and thread, and the pure force of will. But it was a battle, and she would not lose. The interior confirmed every suspicion she might have had about 4 men living without a woman for 6 years. Unwashed dishes piled in the dry sink. A structure of precarious engineering that defied gravity and hygiene in equal measure. Clothes draped over chair backs hung from door handles, and in one memorable case stuffed into a cooking pot. A thin layer of dust covered every surface. The pantry, when she opened it, contained a quantity of dried beans, a slab of bacon turning questionable colors, and 3 cans of peaches that appeared to be older than Wyatt. The smell was a complex bouquet of wood smoke, leather horse, and the particular musk of 4 adult men living in close quarters with limited interest in ventilation. Clara surveyed the disaster. Her face revealed nothing. Then she set down her carpet bag. She placed the wicker basket on the table with careful precision. She rolled up her sleeves. Where do you keep the lye soap? That first evening she cooked. She worked with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that this meal was an audition, a first impression that would shape everything that followed. She had limited materials to work with, but she had skill and she had determination. And from the unpromising contents of the Crawford pantry, she produced a stew that was by any reasonable standard a minor miracle. She also baked bread, real bread, risen and golden and fragrant, the smell of it filling the house like a benediction, like warmth made visible, like something that had been missing from these walls so long that its return was almost painful. It was the bread that undid them. When Stone broke off a piece and put it in his mouth, he went completely still. His eyes closed briefly. And for a moment, the granite of his face cracked just enough to show the man beneath. Something softened around his eyes. Something loosened in his jaw. Something shifted in the deep amber of his gaze that looked, if you knew where to find it, like the first thaw of spring. Wyatt ate 3 pieces before anyone could stop him. His eyes grew bright with an emotion he could not name. "I have not tasted bread like this since Ma was alive," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Clara had to turn away quickly so they would not see her face, because the sound of that young man's voice breaking over the memory of his dead mother reached inside her chest and found the place where her own grief lived, and for a moment the two sorrows touched, and the recognition was almost more than she could bear. But she had also made a mistake. In her determination to impress, she had used nearly all of the flour, enough to last 2 weeks under normal rationing, gone in a single evening of baking. She did not know this. She had never had to think about flour as a finite resource, something to be measured and hoarded and stretched across weeks of isolation. Later that night, when Clara had retired to the small room they had prepared for her, Stone stood in the pantry staring at the nearly empty flour bin. Colton found him there. "She used most of the flour," Stone said. His voice held no anger, only the flat pragmatism of a man accustomed to calculating survival in pounds and ounces. "She does not know," Colton said. "She has never lived like this." "No, she has not." It was not a criticism. It was an observation, and it carried within it a question that neither of them spoke aloud. What kind of life had she lived, this woman with fine hands and a fine dress and the haunted eyes of someone who has lost everything? That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Stone sat across the kitchen table from Clara and began the conversation that would change the course of both their lives. The lamp between them threw shadows that made the room feel smaller, more intimate than it was. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her chin raised with a dignity that was clearly costing her considerable effort. He sat with his forearms on the table, his massive hands loosely clasped, watching her with the same careful attention he gave to a landscape he was trying to read for signs of weather. "Miss Ashford, you are not what we expected. I could say the same, Mr. Crawford." There was the ghost of something in her voice. Not quite humor, but an awareness of the absurdity of their situation that surprised him. "You are educated," he said. "You are not a farmer's daughter or a factory girl. That dress is fine cloth, even if it is the only one you own. You speak like a woman who has read books and sat in parlors and had conversations about things more interesting than the price of feed." He paused. His amber eyes held hers. "Women like you do not answer advertisements in the matrimonial times unless they are out of options. What are you running from?" The question hung in the air between them. The fire in the hearth popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. She looked at this man, this mountain of duty, in silence, and she made a decision. Not to tell the whole truth. She was not ready for that, and neither was he, but to tell enough that the foundation between them would be something other than a lie. "I have 3 younger sisters in Boston. Abigail is 19, Eliza is 17, Nora is 15. Our father is dead. Our mother is dead. We have no family, no money, and no one to protect us." She paused. And when she continued, her voice had the quality of something being stripped bare. "Layer by careful layer. I did not come here for a husband, Mr. Crawford. I came here to survive. I came here to find a safe place where I can bring my sisters before the winter. They are alone in a boarding house in Boston with enough money to last perhaps 3 more months. If I cannot find them a home by then, I do not know what will become of them." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what she had just admitted. She had crossed a continent on a train ticket purchased by a stranger, answered an advertisement meant for a wife, walked into a house of 4 men she had never met, all to save 3 girls in a boarding house 2,000 miles away. Stone looked at her for a long time. He saw the steel in her, the same unbending determination he recognized in his own bones. He saw 2 people forged in the same furnace of loss and responsibility, shaped by the same relentless pressure. "I will work harder than any woman you have ever known," she continued. Her voice was steady now, carrying the force of a vow. I will cook clean men, tend the garden, and do whatever this ranch requires. I ask only for shelter and the chance to prove my worth. If after 1 month you find me lacking, I will leave. You have my word. She was offering the ultimatum herself, handing him the power, and in doing so revealing a strength that no amount of fine dresses and trembling hands could disguise. 1 month, Stone said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by something he could not name. You have 1 month to prove this arrangement is not a fool's bargain. After that, we talk about your sisters. Thank you, Mr. Crawford, Stone he corrected, and then looked away as though the intimacy of his own name had startled him. If you are living under my roof, you will call me Stone. He stood. He pushed back from the table. He walked to the door and paused there, his hand on the frame, his back to her. He wanted to say something else, something about the bread, about the way she had walked into his house like a soldier walking into battle, about the fact that for the first time in 6 years the kitchen smelled like home. But the words would not come. They were stuck somewhere behind the granite wall he had spent half a decade building, and he did not know how to get them out. He left without another word. Clara sat alone at the table, her hands trembling in her lap. She whispered into the empty room to a sister who could not hear her, across 2,000 miles of darkness and distance and desperate hope. Hold on, Abby. I'm going to bring you home. That night, Clara could not sleep. In the strange log house surrounded by 4 strange men, with 2,000 miles between her and her 3 sisters, sleep was a luxury she could not afford. She lay on the narrow bed in the small room they had prepared for her, clean but bare, smelling of pine wood and dust, and she took the quilt from the wicker basket. She spread it across her lap, the dark blues and grays in the moonlight that filtered through the window cracks. The fabric absorbed the pale light, turning the quilt into a pool of shadow in her hands. She ran her fingers along the stitching. Thousands of tiny, precise stitches her mother had placed with the meticulous love of a woman who understood that some things must be sewn into the very fabric of life to survive. Clara touched the quilt and whispered into the darkness, I am sorry, Papa. I am so sorry. The apology carried the weight of everything she could not fix. That she had not stopped the trial, had not saved her father from prison, had not kept her mother alive, had not protected her sisters from having to run like criminals when the only crime their family had committed was trusting the wrong man. She did not know that Stone stood in the hallway outside her door, barefoot, breathing shallow, unable to sleep because for the first time in 6 years, the house held the breath of a 5th person, and the change unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He had risen to check the door, the nightly habit, when he heard the whisper through the thin wood. He heard every word, and his face hidden in the shadow of the hallway shifted from wary curiosity to something deeper, something more dangerous, recognition. He knew with a certainty that settled into his bones like the cold of a Montana winter that whatever this woman was carrying, whatever she was running from, whatever secret lived inside that wicker basket and that whispered apology, it was bigger and darker and more painful than anything she had yet revealed. And he knew something else too, something that frightened him far more than any secret. He was not going to let her carry it alone. The decision did not arrive as a choice. It arrived like gravity, like breath, like something that had been there since the moment her small hand disappeared inside his on the stagecoach platform. He was only now recognizing it, and the recognition terrified him more than blizzards, more than debt, more than everything the Montana Territory had thrown at him in 30 years. He returned to his room into the darkness, lay on his bed, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time since he buried his parents in frozen ground, Stone Crawford allowed himself to want something that was not survival, but life. This is your home now, Stone would say those words later. But tonight, neither of them knew it yet. Tonight was just the beginning, the first crack in the granite, the first warmth in a long winter. And somewhere behind the mountains, the storm was already building. But Clara did not know what was coming from Boston. And when it arrived, everything would change. The days that followed moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of life on a working ranch. And Clara Ashford threw herself into the labor with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including herself. She scrubbed the house from floor to ceiling, attacking the accumulated grime of 6 bachelor years with lye soap and sheer determination. She reorganized the pantry this time with a careful eye toward rationing that she had not possessed on her first night. She mended clothes, patched curtains, started a kitchen garden in the neglected plot beside the house, turning the hard soil with a fury that left her hands blistered and her back aching by noon and throbbing by dark. She baked bread again, but this time she measured the flour with the precision of an apothecary, stretching each precious cup as far as it would go. Stone noticed. He did not say a word, but when he walked past the kitchen and saw her measuring with a spoon, instead of pouring freely, he paused in the doorway long enough for her to feel his presence. She looked up. Their eyes met. No words were needed. A silent acknowledgement that she had learned, that she was adapting, that she was not the city girl he had feared she might be. He nodded once, a gesture so small it was nearly invisible, and walked on. Clara stood beside the flour bin, feeling that nod warm in her chest longer than it should have. Each morning she rose before dawn, built the fire before anyone else stirred, learned to stack kindling in a pyramid of birch bark and small sticks, so the air could circulate the way she had watched Stone do it, not from instruction, but from observation. The first time she tried, smoke filled the kitchen, and Colton had to open every window while coughing and laughing simultaneously. By the 10th morning, the fire burned steady and strong, the stove hot and ready. By the time Stone's boots crossed the threshold at first light, he was always the first. And now each morning a cup of coffee waited for him on the table. Strong, black, frontier style, brewed by watching, not by asking. He never thanked her with words. But one morning she found a small bundle of wildflowers in a tin cup on the kitchen windowsill. The stems were broken, the leaves were crushed. The hands that had placed them there were clearly not accustomed to flowers. But the effort was the most beautiful thing she had seen since leaving Boston. She noticed the wildflowers were the same kind that grew along the trail Stone walked each morning to check the fences. She kept that discovery to herself, quiet and precious. The house began to change. Not quickly, not overnight, but the way spring changes Montana. Slowly, then suddenly, then everywhere at once. Clean curtains catching morning light. Floors showing their original wood grain. The smell of bread replacing dust and sweat and neglect. And more important than any physical change, laughter. The quiet, surprising kind. The kind that rose unbidden at breakfast when Wyatt told the story of a calf that outsmarted him by walking through the one fence post he had not yet repaired. The kind that escaped Garrett when Clara corrected his Latin pronunciation and he realized with genuine delight that she was right. The kind that Colton provoked, deliberately lobbing verbal grenades across the dinner table and then sitting back with barely concealed pleasure when she returned fire with devastating accuracy. Even Stone's granite face softened by degrees so small they were measurable only by those who knew him well. He did not smile exactly, but the lines around his eyes changed their character. They were no longer carved exclusively by worry. Something else was being written there, something that his brothers noticed and had the good sense not to mention. Wyatt and Clara found each other without effort. His openness and her warmth met like two halves of a key that had simply never been placed together before. He showed her the ranch with the eagerness of a boy who loved his land with an almost religious devotion. The creek where the trout ran thick in summer, and he taught her to read the water's surface to know where the fish gathered. How the light reflected differently when a school passed underneath. The meadow where a newborn foal stumbled on legs made of sticks, and he sat for hours watching, calling each one by name. The ridge at sunset where three mountain ranges stacked against the horizon like the spines of sleeping giants. Look at this, Miss Ashford. When the light hits the peaks at this angle, the first one turns gold, then the second goes orange, then the third goes purple, like 3 layers of paint that have not dried yet. In return, she showed him the constellations from her father's worn astronomy book, sitting on the porch in the evenings, her finger tracing lines between stars while he listened with the rapt attention of a student who has found his favorite teacher. He memorized every constellation within a week and invented names for the stars she could not identify, because every star deserves a name, even the small ones. "You belong here," Wyatt said one evening. He said it the way he said everything, naturally, without thinking, like stating a fact about the weather. They were sitting on the fence rail watching sunset shoulders touching legs swinging, and the sentence was so simple it was almost invisible. But Clara had to look away because her eyes stung, because it was the first time in 2 years that anyone had told her she belonged anywhere. Garrett approached from the side the way he approached everything, with quiet observation and careful thought. He discovered that she read not as a pastime but as a necessity, the way other people breathed. They began exchanging books without words. Left on the doorstep, picked up, returned with a corner, folded at the favorite passage. A silent commerce that required no negotiation. One evening she handed him the book she was reading, open to a passage. "Read this," she said. "It reminds me of the way you speak." Garrett read. It was a passage about the strength of silence, about the value of words when they are rare. He looked up. Clara had already returned to her own reading. And in that moment, something that was not romance, but was deeper than romance, connected two minds that recognized the same language. Another evening, he caught a glimpse of the wicker basket's contents. Books, pressed flowers, drawing supplies, and the quilt, dark blues and grays, somber and beautiful. "My mother was making it for my father," Clara said softly, her fingers tracing the fabric. She never finished it. She never finished. Garrett saw the depth of pain in her eyes and asked no more questions. But that night he left on her doorstep a book of poetry open to a poem about unfinished things that are beautiful still. Colton waged an entirely different campaign. He was accustomed to charming women with the ease of a man who had never met one he could not disarm. Clara's absolute refusal to be impressed was both baffling and, to his considerable annoyance, completely intoxicating. "A woman's touch certainly improves this place," he offered one morning, leaning against the kitchen door frame, with the smile that had made 3 women blush in a single evening at the Redstone Crossing dance the previous autumn. "A man's effort in the barn would improve it more," she replied without looking up from her bread dough. "I could teach you to ride properly. I could teach you to cook something that does not threaten the stomach." He tried again with small offerings. A wildflower on the windowsill. The choicest cut of venison from his hunt wrapped in cloth and left on the kitchen table. She acknowledged none of them, but a faint blush crept across her cheeks each time she found one. And Colton, reading her the way he read a poker table, knew that the cards were falling his way. Not for romance, he realized with a surprise that rearranged something in his chest, but for something rarer. Respect, real respect, the kind you cannot fake, the kind he had never given to anyone outside his own brothers. "That is what a good man does," Colton said when Clara asked why he had fixed the porch step that was not his responsibility. And he heard himself say his father's words and realized with quiet shock that he was becoming the man his father would have been proud of. Between Stone and Clara, the thing that grew was not warmth or charm or intellectual connection. It was something harder to name and impossible to ignore. The silent recognition of 2 people with carrying the same kind of scars, the same kind of responsibility, the same habit of putting everyone else first until they forgot they were people who also needed to be put first. They communicated in logistics and silence. "We will need more flour from Hawkins' store. I will see to it. The roof above the pantry is leaking. I am aware. The herd is short 2 head. I will look at first light. Short. Practical. Not a syllable wasted. Like 2 people who had worked together for 30 years instead of 3 weeks. And it was precisely that comfort, that naturalness, that frightened them both. Clara noticed the way Stone checked the door every night before retiring, testing the latch, scanning the darkness, his hand resting briefly on the rifle that hung by the entrance. A ritual of protection so ingrained it was unconscious. He had done it for 6 years, every night, without rest. And she realized that he did not check the door because of any real danger. He checked it because that was the only way he knew how to say, "I am keeping you safe. All of you. Every night. Until I cannot anymore." Stone noticed the way Clara hummed while she worked. A low, unconscious melody that filled the rooms with something the house had not contained in 6 years. It was not music exactly. It was the sound of a home being lived in. And it reached inside him and found the place where the loneliness had taken root, and it hurt the way warmth hurts when you have been cold for too long. The way blood flows back into frozen fingers. Painful, but also the sign that life is returning. "The mountain does not care, but I do." Stone said those words when he helped her carry the water bucket from the creek the first time he offered without being asked. And Clara understood that the sentence was not about the mountain at all. In the middle of the 2nd week, Clara made a mistake that nearly undid all the ground she had gained. She found a section of fence along the north pasture that had collapsed. Posts rotted through, wire sagging, rather than ask for help. She decided to fix it herself. She had watched them work fences. It did not look complicated, and she needed with a desperation that went beyond reason to prove that she was not a burden, that she could carry her weight, that she deserved to stay. She spent the better part of a morning wrestling with fence posts and wire. She was making progress, painful and bloody progresses, her hands torn and her arms aching when the remaining section of fence gave way entirely. The posts toppled like dominoes. The wire snapped with a sound like a rifle shot, and the cattle that had been pressing against the weakened barrier surged through the gap and scattered across the open meadow. It took all four brothers and the rest of the day to round them up. By the time the last steer was back inside the repaired fence line, the sun was low, and everyone was exhausted and caked in mud and frustration. Stone found Clara standing by the corral, her torn hands pressed against her apron, her face a mask of misery and shame. She expected anger. She had prepared herself for it the way she prepared for everything, by building a wall and standing behind it. His voice when it came was not angry. It was something worse. It was tired, and it was honest. You did not need to prove anything by getting yourself killed. I am accustomed to handling things on my own. Quiet, then softer than she had ever heard him speak. You do not have to be accustomed to that anymore. Not here. We will get through this. And for the first time, the word "we" included her. She stared at him. Something cracked behind her eyes. Not a wall falling, but a window opening. For the first time since she arrived in Montana, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she did not have to carry everything alone, that there were shoulders broader than hers and hands stronger than hers, and that accepting their help was not weakness. It was trust. One evening she was sitting on the porch staring at the stars. She looked impossibly small against the vastness, a single point of warmth in an infinity of cold light. "Do you ever feel like the mountains could just swallow you whole?" she asked without turning. Stone considered the question with the seriousness he gave to all questions. Every day. But they have not managed it yet. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. She turned and looked up at him, surprised. And for a moment, the distance between them shrank to something small enough to cross with a single step. The lamplight from the window caught her face and her eyes and the loose strand of hair that the wind pressed against her cheek. Stone felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement deep beneath the granite. He cleared his throat, touched the brim of his hat, and retreated into the house. Because the alternative was to stand there in the starlight and say something that would change everything. And he was not ready. Not yet. "Winter always ends," he whispered beside his bedroom window. But this time the words carried a meaning he had never before allowed. Hope. But what Clara did not know yet was what was coming from Boston. And when it arrived, everything would change. 3 weeks had passed since Clara stepped off the overland stage. And then the peace shattered. Garrett had ridden into Redstone Crossing for supplies on a Tuesday morning. He returned in the late afternoon with the provisions loaded and the mail pouch slung over his saddle horn. Among the usual assortment of seed catalogs and territorial notices was a single envelope addressed in a careful feminine hand to Miss C. Ashford Crawford, Ranch Redstone Crossing, Montana Territory. The postmark was Boston. Garrett handed the letter to Clara at the kitchen table where she was rolling out pie dough. She saw the handwriting and the postmark, and Garrett watched the color drain from her face so quickly it was like watching a candle blown out. Her hands, which had been steady and sure on the rolling pin, went rigid. She picked up the envelope with fingers that trembled visibly and excused herself to her room without another word. The letter was from Agnes Barlow, a lawyer's clerk in Boston who had been the Ashford family's only remaining ally, a woman of fierce, quiet loyalty who had promised to keep watch while the sisters scattered. "My dearest girl, I pray this reaches you safely. I must be direct. A man has been making inquiries in your old neighborhood. He is from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, well-dressed, polite, and thorough in a way that frightens me. He has been asking about your father's business affairs, about the family circumstances after the trial, and most pointedly about your current whereabouts. He visited the boarding house on Milk Street. He spoke to Mrs. Cranshaw. He knows you went west." The name Hargrove was mentioned in connection with his employment. You know what this means. Please be careful. Please be invisible. And for the love of God, burn this letter. Yours in friendship and fear. Agnes. Clara read the letter 3 times, folded it, pressed it against her chest, closed her eyes, and felt the fragile architecture of safety she had been building over 3 weeks begin to crack and shift beneath her feet like river ice in spring. 4 days later, Colton rode into Redstone Crossing for a poker game at the saloon. He was 2 hands into a game of 5-card draw when the stranger walked in. The man was immediately obviously wrong for Redstone Crossing. He wore a city suit of dark gray wool cut with a precision that spoke of Eastern tailors and Eastern money. He wore a bowler hat. He moved with quiet, purposeful economy. He ordered a whiskey, placed it on the bar, and let it sit there untouched. A prop rather than a beverage. He watched the room with eyes that cataloged everything and revealed nothing. And then with the practiced casualness of a man who has asked questions in 1,000 rooms, he struck up a conversation with Mr. Hawkins. I understand the Crawford Ranch has taken on a new member of the household recently. A young woman, I believe. I would be most interested to know her name and circumstances. Colton's ears, tuned to the frequencies of deception, the way a piano is tuned to middle C, heard the question clearly despite the noise of the room. He folded his poker hand, spent the next hour watching the stranger. The man spoke to 3 more people. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Friendly opening, gradual narrowing of focus. The name Crawford introduced casually. The question about the woman asked as an afterthought. It was expert work, and it was aimed at Clara. Colton rode home hard that night, found Stone cleaning a rifle by lamplight. There is a man in town, city clothes, bowler hat, moves like law, but not from any agency I recognize. He is asking about Clara. What kind of questions? The kind a man asks when he is being paid to find someone who does not want to be found. Stone found Clara on the porch. She could not sleep. The fear that had returned with the letter had settled into her body like a chronic illness. Clara, I know why you are here. Colton saw him. Yes, a long silence. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. I have not been entirely honest with you, Stone. I reckoned as much. She turned. In the moonlight, her face was stripped of all pretense. What remained was the face of a 22-year-old woman who had been carrying a weight designed to break people twice her age. She told him about her father, Thomas Ashford, clockmaker and inventor. A brilliant man, a gentle man, a man who believed in the fundamental goodness of people with the same faith other men placed in gravity. He had taken a business partner named Silas Hargrove to finance his most ambitious invention, an improved industrial steam valve. Hargrove was a thief, not the crude kind. The kind that shakes your hand and smiles at your children and steals your life's work with a pen and a forged signature while you are looking the other way. He had embezzled from the company, stolen the patent paperwork, replaced the original filings with altered documents listing himself as sole inventor. And when the discrepancies surfaced, he had pointed the finger at the only other man in the room. Thomas Ashford was arrested, convicted, sent to prison. 18 months later, in a cold cell in a Massachusetts penitentiary, he died of pneumonia. He was 51 years old. They would not even let us visit him at the end. Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. We received a form letter. It said that prisoner number 472 had died and that arrangements should be made at our earliest convenience. That is how we learned our father was gone. A number on a form. After Thomas died, the house was seized. Their mother, Margaret, did not survive the winter. She died in a boarding house on Milk Street, holding the unfinished quilt she had been making for her husband. Then Silas Hargrove came calling, arrived in a carriage, offered to become their legal guardian. His smile was warm, his concern was generous, and everything about him radiated benevolence. Clara saw through it immediately. His concern was not concern, it was appetite. His generosity was not generosity, it was acquisition. He did not want to help the Ashford sisters. He wanted to possess them. She refused, gathered her sisters, ran from city to city, job to job, always looking over her shoulder, and Hargrove always found them. He had money and patience and the particular relentless focus of a man who cannot tolerate the existence of something he desires and does not own. The man in town, Clara said. He was hired by Hargrove. Pinkerton men. They are thorough. If he has come this far, Hargrove will not be far behind. I have put you and your brothers in danger. I should never have come here. I will pack my things and leave in the morning. The silence that followed was full, crowded with everything she had just said and everything he was about to decide. You are not leaving. You do not understand. He will come. He has lawyers and money, and this ranch has stood against blizzards, droughts, and cattle rustlers. I reckon it can stand against one fancy man from Boston. Then softer, in a voice she had never heard him use, a voice with the granite peeled back. You should have told me sooner, Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his mouth, spoken in that low, rough voice on that dark porch under those infinite stars, cracked something open in both of them. Not a wall falling, something more delicate. A door long sealed, swinging open on rusted hinges. This is your home now. Stone said those words for the first time, and they changed everything. Silas Hargrove arrived in Redstone Crossing 11 days later, and he arrived the way poison arrives in a body, quietly, invisibly, with devastating precision. He did not ride in with hired guns. He came in a rented buckboard, dressed in a suit so impeccably tailored it seemed to exist in a different dimension from the dusty clothing of Redstone Crossing. He was a handsome man in his late 40s, silver at his temples. The kind of face that projected trustworthiness, the way certain expensive watches project time, smoothly, continuously, with absolute certainty. His smile was the most dangerous thing about him, warm and wide and generous, and it had exactly the same relationship to genuine human feeling that a painted backdrop has to an actual landscape. His first stop was the bank. He walked in with a leather portfolio and walked out having purchased the Crawford mortgage in its entirety. Banker Pritchard accepted the offer without the pretense of reluctance. Eastern money, a premium above the note's face value, a handshake. 60 minutes. Done. His second move was subtler. He visited Hawkins' general store and paid off the Crawford account. Then he spent an hour talking to every customer who came through the door, introducing himself as Clara's guardian, expressing deep concern for her welfare, painting a picture of a young woman lured to a harsh land by men who saw her as free labor rather than a human being. By the end of his first day, half the town believed him. Mr. Hawkins rode to the ranch the following morning. He stood in the yard, turning his hat in his hands. He is smooth stone. I have never seen anything like it. Got the ear of half the town already. Says he is here to rescue that girl. Says you boys took advantage. He talks like a preacher and tips like a king, and people are listening. Hawkins hesitated, then added the part that mattered most. He bought your mortgage, Stone. Went to Pritchard and bought the note outright. He owns the paper on your land. The sentence landed like a physical blow. The mortgage. The land. His parents' graves were on that land. 6 years of work, of sacrifice, of sleepless nights and frozen mornings. All of it now resting in the hands of a man who had come to Montana for the sole purpose of reclaiming a woman as though she were lost luggage. 3 days later, Hargrove came to collect on his investment. He rode to the Crawford Ranch on a clear spring morning with Sheriff Boyd Tanner at his side and the Pinkerton Calvin Mercer following at a discreet distance on a roan mare. 5 members of the Crawford household stood on the porch, Clara at the center, hands clasped before her, chin raised, blue eyes fixed on Hargrove without a trace of the fear she was feeling. On either side, in an unconscious formation that placed their bodies between her and the approaching riders, stood 4 of the largest men the Montana Territory could offer. Stone on her right, hand near his belt, face carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Garrett on her left, standing straight, eyes sharp with the particular intensity of a man who had been preparing for this moment with books instead of bullets. Colton slightly behind, posture deceptively casual. Eyes anything but, and Wyatt at the far end, the youngest, fists clenched at his sides, his boyish face set in lines that were a mirror image of his eldest brothers. They looked like what they were, a family. Clara, my dear girl, Hargrove began. His voice was honey and oil. Thank heavens I have found you. I have been worried beyond measure. I am not your dear girl, Mr. Hargrove, and I am not in need of your concern. Hargrove turned to the sheriff. He produced documents, a guardianship order from Massachusetts, and the deed of mortgage. You are standing on my land, Mr. Crawford. I could have every one of you removed by morning. Stone stepped forward, placed himself directly between Hargrove and Clara, close enough that the smaller man had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. The size difference was stark and deliberate. This woman is my betrothed. The word detonated in the yard. Behind him, Clara's lips parted in shock. Colton's eyebrows climbed toward his hat brim. Garrett went very still. Wyatt made a sound halfway between a gasp and a cheer. It was a lie. A desperate, magnificent, reckless lie. The kind a man tells when the truth has run out of ammunition and the only weapon left is audacity. It was Garrett who stepped his butt into the breach. Quiet Bookish overlooked Garrett, who had spent 3 days buried in territorial law for precisely this moment. Your guardianship order, Mr. Hargrove, was issued by a court in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are standing in Montana territory, federal territory. I am curious whether Sheriff Tanner is prepared to enforce an out-of-state guardianship order without first consulting the territorial magistrate in Helena, particularly in a case involving an adult woman of 22 years of age who states unequivocally that she is here of her own free will. I imagine such a consultation could take considerable time. Weeks, certainly, perhaps months. The territorial courts are not known for their speed. Fury crossed Hargrove's face. Brief, controlled. He had not expected resistance, certainly not legal resistance from a rancher who spent his days chopping wood. This is not over, Crawford. Not by a long measure. He rode away. The dust of his departure hung in the air like a promise kept in the wrong direction. 3 days later, the notice arrived by courier. The holder of the Crawford Ranch mortgage was calling the note due in full. 30 days to pay the entire outstanding balance or vacate the property. Signed by Silas Hargrove in a hand that was elegant, precise, and devoid of mercy. Clara waited until the house was asleep. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The candle had burned nearly to nothing, wax pooling across the tin dish in strange shapes. She held Garrett's pen, and she wrote a letter to Silas Hargrove. The letter was short and direct. She offered to return to Boston voluntarily, to accept his guardianship, to do whatever he required, in exchange for one condition: release the Crawford mortgage. Leave the brothers in peace. She was offering herself as a trade, her freedom for their land. She wrote each word with the care of a woman signing away her own life. No trembling, no hesitation. Because this was what Clara Ashford did. She sacrificed. She had sacrificed her childhood to care for her sisters, sacrificed safety to run, sacrificed hope to keep her sisters hoping. Sacrifice was her mother tongue, the thing she did best, the thing she would do until there was nothing left to sacrifice. And that was the tragedy. Not that she was willing to sacrifice, but that she did not know how to do anything else. She did not know how to be saved. She did not know how to sit still and let someone stand in front of her and take the blow. Because for 2 years she had been the one standing in front. Always. She sealed the letter, placed it on the table, and in the silent moment after, when the candle guttered and the wind moaned outside and the darkness pressed thick enough to touch, she allowed herself to think of the things she never thought about. Stone, the way he looked at her, quick, stolen, then away, as though caught at something private. The way his hand had rested on her shoulder when the grouse startled her. 2 seconds, warm, steady, then gone. The way he had said, "This is your home now," 3 words. But heavier than any speech she had ever heard in a Boston parlor. She was leaving something behind, something she did not yet have a name for, something she had never had before and therefore did not know she was losing. But she felt it, in her chest, where the quilt still touched when she held it at night. A hollow space taking shape. A hollow space that had the shape of a log house, the smell of morning coffee, the sound of an axe at dawn, the silhouette of 4 figures on a porch at sunset. She was leaving home, and she only realized it was home in the exact moment she decided to go. Wyatt found the letter at 3 in the morning. He had woken with a thirst and padded into the kitchen in bare feet. The letter sat on the table in the moonlight, addressed in Clara's careful hand. He should not have read it. He knew he should not. But something about the sight of it, a sealed letter on a dark table in a house full of sleeping people, tripped an alarm in his young heart. He broke the seal and read by moonlight and felt the bottom drop out of his world. He brought the letter to Stone. Stone read it standing in the hallway, his face lit by the candle Wyatt held. He read it once slowly, then again. When he looked up, his face held an expression Wyatt had never seen. Not anger exactly, something raw, more painful than anger. The expression of a man discovering that the thing he was most afraid of losing was trying to sacrifice itself for him. He found Clara in her room, awake, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands in her lap. She had heard Wyatt in the kitchen. She knew. You were going to sell yourself to save us. It is your family's ranch, your parents' land. Their graves are here. I have no right to cost you everything. This is your home now. The words stopped her. She looked up, and in the dim light she saw something in his face that she had never seen there before. A vulnerability so profound it transformed the entire architecture of the man. The granite was gone. What remained was human, and hurting, and absolutely certain. This land is yours now too. You tilled that garden, you baked that bread, you filled this house with the sound of living. Do not ever value yourself less than a piece of ground. His voice cracked on the word ever. And for a moment the granite face broke open and she saw what lay beneath 6 years of grief and guilt and love that had never found a place to land. He reached into his pocket, produced the letter already torn to pieces, held them in his open palm, then let them fall. A slow cascade of paper fragments drifting to the floor like snow. We face this together, or not at all. A man keeps his word, his father's words. And this was the word Stone Crawford kept. Clara looked at the torn pieces of her surrender scattered across the floor, and something inside her broke open. Not in collapse, but in release. She nodded. She could not speak, but she nodded. And in the nod was everything she could not say. Gratitude and terror and the first fragile shoots of something she was beginning to recognize, with wonder and with fear, as the beginning of love. And outside the window the Montana night stretched on, vast, cold, full of stars, and somewhere in the darkness a storm was still building. But they would face it together now. Whatever came next. We will get through this. Not hope anymore. Not a wish. A decision. Made by two people who had spent their whole lives being strong alone and were only now discovering that there was a different kind of strength. The terrifying, exhilarating, irreversible strength of being strong with someone else. It was the following evening when hope seemed thinnest and the walls seemed to be closing in that the quilt gave up its secret. Clara was sitting by the fire, her mother's quilt spread across her lap, her fingers tracing the stitches for the 1,000th time. It had become her ritual of comfort. This touching of the fabric her mother's hands had touched. This physical connection to a woman who had loved her family enough to try to sew their salvation into cloth. Garrett was nearby pretending to read, his eyes drifting periodically to the quilt with the focused curiosity of a mind that was always working. He had noticed the quilt before. He had noticed everything about it. The quality of the fabric, the precision of the stitching, the somber palette of blues and grays that seemed chosen not for beauty, but for mourning. But tonight, something caught his attention that he had not seen before. "Clara," he said, setting down his book, "may I look at that more closely?" She handed it to him, and he turned it over with careful hands. Along the backing cloth, invisible at a casual glance but unmistakable, under the scrutiny of a man trained to find meaning in details, was writing. Not embroidery, not decoration, writing. Letters and numbers and symbols stitched in threads so close in color to the backing fabric that they were nearly invisible. Rendered in stitches so small and precise that each character was barely a quarter-inch tall. "Everyone," Garrett said, and something in his voice brought the entire household to their feet. "Come look at this." They gathered around. 5 people crowding close in the firelight, staring at the back of an unfinished quilt that a dead woman had made for a dead man. And what they saw there changed everything. It was a coded message, page numbers, dates, cryptic phrases, references to technical documents and legal filings, and patent numbers that meant nothing to anyone who was not intimately familiar with the work of Thomas Ashford. "This is not the missing ledger," Garrett breathed, his mind racing ahead of his words. "This is a key, a guide, a map to a second hidden copy of the evidence your father kept." Your mother must have known, must have anticipated that the original ledger would be found and seized or destroyed. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. My father kept duplicate copies of everything. He stored them with his solicitor, Mr. Pemberton in Boston. He was meticulous. He trusted no single repository. Then the proof exists, Garrett said. Somewhere. The proof that Hargrove stole the patent and framed your father. Your mother encoded the path to it in this quilt. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the sound of 5 people breathing too fast. Hope, which had been lying face down in the dirt for days, stirred and lifted its head. But the proof was in Boston, and Hargrove was 3 miles away, holding the mortgage and the power and the patience to wait them out. It was Colton who saw the opening. He had been leaning against the mantel, arms folded, watching the scene with the particular focus of a man whose mind operates best under pressure. While the others stared at the quilt and felt hope, Colton was thinking 3 moves ahead. Running scenarios, calculating odds, reading the board the way he read a poker table. We do not need the proof, he said. And his voice had a quality that made everyone turn. The voice of a man who has just drawn a card he was not supposed to draw and is deciding whether to play it. We just need Hargrove to think we have it. He looked at each of them in turn. Then his eyes settled on the Pinkerton. Calvin Mercer, he said. He is not Hargrove's man. He is a Pinkerton. They have a code, a reputation. They work for whoever pays, but they do not knowingly work for criminals. If we can make Mercer believe that Hargrove is the criminal, that we have evidence that a fraud case is about to blow open, the Pinkerton's own professional integrity becomes our weapon. It was audacious, it was reckless, it was, in the parlance of the poker table, a bluff of monumental proportions. Garrett transcribed a section of the quilt's coded message onto a clean sheet of paper. He arranged the numbers and references in a format that looked like extracted evidence rather than raw cipher. It was convincing enough to give a professional investigator pause. It was nowhere near convincing enough to survive actual scrutiny. If he calls the bluff, Stone said, his voice flat with the weight of what they were risking, we have nothing. We lose everything. We are already losing everything, Colton replied. This is the only card we have left, and I am very, very good at cards. He looked at Clara. She looked at Stone. Let him try, she said. My father trusted people. It was his greatest weakness and his finest quality. Let us trust Calvin Mercer's honor. Stone held her gaze for a long moment. 2 pillars of responsibility staring at each other across a room full of fear and hope and the tattered remains of a quilt that a dead woman had filled with truth. He nodded once. Hard. Do it. Colton reached for his hat. He picked up the page of transcribed code and tucked it inside his vest against his chest, where it lay against his heartbeat like a loaded gun. At first light, he rode toward Redstone Crossing. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that turned your breath to silver and made the mountains look close enough to touch. He pushed his horse to a canter, then a gallop, the hoofbeats pounding the frozen trail like a drum roll before a verdict. Behind him, 4 people stood on the porch of the Crawford Ranch and watched him ride away. And none of them breathed easily, and none of them looked away until the dust of his departure had settled completely and he had vanished into the distance. A single figure riding toward the biggest gamble of all their lives. The hotel restaurant in Redstone Crossing was a room of modest ambitions. 6 tables covered in oilcloth. A counter where a woman named Mrs. Drury served eggs and coffee with the enthusiasm of a person fulfilling a prison sentence. Windows so streaked with grease that the morning light entered the room already exhausted. Calvin Mercer sat at the table nearest the window, eating his breakfast, with the methodical precision of a man who approached food the way he approached everything else, as a task to be completed efficiently and without sentiment. His plate held 2 eggs, a slice of ham, and a biscuit arranged in a geometric pattern that suggested a mind uncomfortable with disorder. His bowler hat rested on the chair beside him. His coat was buttoned to the second button. No more, no less. Everything about him communicated a single unwavering message. I am a professional. I am here to do it. The job is all that matters. Colton walked into the restaurant at 7 minutes past 8. He ordered a coffee he would not drink, and he sat down across from the Pinkerton detective without invitation. Mercer looked up from his eggs. His expression did not change. his eyes gray and flat as Riverstones registered Colton's presence with the same neutral attention he would give to a change in the weather. Noteworthy, potentially relevant, but not yet cause for concern. Mr. Crawford. It was not a greeting. It was an identification, spoken with the precision of a man filing a report. Mr. Mercer. Colton removed his hat, set it on the table, and placed a single sheet of paper beside the Pinkertons' coffee cup. He did this slowly, deliberately, the way a poker player lays down a card he wants his opponent to study. Every gesture calculated, the speed of his hand, the angle of the paper, the distance from the page to the cup. In poker, the way you place your card says more than the card itself. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited. Silence. The kind of silence with purpose. The kind that invites the other man to speak first. Mercer did not speak. Two men sitting across from each other, untouched coffee between them, both knowing this was a negotiation conducted not in words but in patience. Colton spoke first. A calculated choice. The person who speaks first loses the advantage of silence, but gains the advantage of direction. And Colton needed to direct this conversation. His voice was different from the voice he used at home. Stripped of its usual playful edge, carrying instead a cool, measured authority that would have surprised his brothers. This was not Colton the charmer. This was not Colton the troublemaker. This was Colton the gambler, and he was playing the most important hand of his life. My brother's betrothed lost her father to a man like Hargrove, Mr. Mercer, and her father was a very careful man. Thomas Ashford documented every transaction, every meeting, every signature. He was the kind of man who kept records the way some men keep religion, faithfully, meticulously, and against the possibility that one day the truth would need defending. A pause, not because he had run out of words, because the space between two sentences is where the listener processes. Poker taught Colton never to fill every silence. Silence is where your opponent fills in their own thoughts. And thoughts people create themselves are more persuasive than anything you say. Mr. Hargrove believes he holds the only copies of certain documents. Documents that, if examined by a competent authority, would reveal a pattern of embezzlement, patent theft, and the deliberate fabrication of evidence used to convict an innocent man. Mr. Hargrove is mistaken. The originals are safe. That page is a small sample of what we hold. Mercer's eyes moved to the paper. He still did not touch it, but something shifted behind his gaze. A recalibration so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching for it. Colton was watching for it. Colton was watching for everything. Hargrove is a powerful man. Mercer's voice was flat, non-committal, the verbal equivalent of a closed door. Powerful men have the most to lose. You were hired to locate a missing woman. You have located her. She is safe. She is healthy. And she is residing at the Crawford Ranch of her own free will. Your job as contracted is complete. Colton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a register that was almost intimate, but becoming entangled in a fraud and conspiracy case that crosses state lines. A case involving stolen patents, fabricated evidence, and the wrongful imprisonment that led to a man's death. That is a different kind of employment entirely, especially when the evidence is about to become a matter of public record. He stood, left the paper on the table, picked up his hat. You strike me as a man who values facts, Mr. Mercer. I encourage you to look into the ones on that page. Good morning. He walked out of the restaurant and into the cold morning air. He did not look back. His hands were steady. His stride was unhurried. Every visible aspect of his bearing communicated the confidence of a man holding four aces. His heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he could taste copper in the back of his throat. He had just bet everything. The ranch, his brother's future, Clara's freedom, the lives of 3 girls in a Boston boarding house he had never met. All of it on a single page of transcribed cipher. A dead woman's coded stitches rendered into numbers by his brother's careful hand and presented to a stranger with nothing behind it but nerve and the desperate hope that a Pinkerton detective's professional integrity was worth more than Silas Hargrove's money. He mounted his horse and rode out of Redstone Crossing at a walk, because a gallop would have looked like retreat, and Colton Crawford did not retreat. But his jaw ached from clenching and his knuckles were white on the reins. A man keeps his word, but Colton did not keep words. Colton kept nerve. And the 3 days ahead would test that nerve to the absolute limit. Winter always ends, he whispered to himself on the trail home. And he rode at a walk because that was all the faith he had left. The waiting was the worst part, worse than the confrontation with Hargrove, worse than the fear, worse than anything any of them had experienced since Clara stepped off the stagecoach and brought her beautiful, terrible, complicated past into their lives. 1 day passed, then two. No word from Mercer, no movement from Hargrove. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, a cocked hammer, a storm that has announced itself with distant thunder but has not yet decided where to strike. Stone chopped wood, more than needed. The wood pile rose higher than Wyatt's head enough for 2 weeks, but he kept chopping. The rhythm of the axe steady and relentless. Not because the ranch needed wood, but because each stroke was the way Stone Crawford processed what normal people process through conversation. He did not know how to talk about fear, but he knew how to split oak. Clara baked 6 loaves, 7, 8. The kitchen overflowed with more bread than 8 people could eat in a week. But she could not stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant staring into the abyss of the question. What if Colton failed? What if Mercer called the bluff? What if Hargrove won? What if she had to leave? What if? She needed the dough harder. The dough did not object. Garrett read the same passage of territorial law for the 11th time, not because he had not understood it. Garrett Crawford understood law faster than most practicing attorneys, but because rereading gave him the feeling of control. The feeling that if he knew enough, if he prepared enough, if he found the right precedent, the right statute, the right word, then everything would be fine. That was Garrett's faith, that the world operated by rules, and if you knew the rules, you won. But deep inside, where books could not reach, Garrett knew that Silas Hargrove did not play by rules. He played with money. And money on the frontier usually beat rules. Wyatt lost his smile. One afternoon, Clara found him sitting behind the horse barn back against the woods, staring at the meadow without seeing it. She sat down beside him, said nothing, just sat. After a while, Wyatt leaned his head against her shoulder, the gesture of a younger brother she had never had. And in that silence, longer than words, both of them found the thing that words could not give, the simple presence of someone who cared. Is she going to be all right? Wyatt asked Stone that evening, standing outside the horse barn, his voice smaller than his age. All of us are going to be all right, Stone said. Do you promise? Stone looked at his youngest brother, the boy of 14 who had become a man of 20, but who still in moments like these needed to be told that everything would be fine. A man keeps his word, not a direct answer, but Wyatt understood. And in that understanding, he found enough strength to get through the night. On the evening of the second day, Clara brought Stone coffee on the porch. Their fingers touched on the cup, neither pulled away. And this time, Stone did not withdraw his hand after 2 seconds. He let his fingers rest there, touching hers on the warm cup, and both of them felt the heat. Not from the coffee, from the place where skin met skin, small and infinite in everything. Are you afraid? She asked. Terrified, he said. The word came out raw, unvarnished. The most honest thing he had ever spoken. Because Stone Crawford, who had faced blizzards and charging bulls and 6 years of grinding devastation, stood on his own porch and admitted to fear. And the admission cost him something visible, a piece of armor falling away. Me too, she whispered. We will get through this. And this time, both of them believed it. On the morning of the third day, a rider appeared on the trail from Redstone Crossing. Wyatt saw him first. A dark figure on a roan mare moving at a steady trot through the morning mist that pooled in the valley like spilled milk. Someone is coming. The 4 words sent a current through the household that brought everyone to the porch in under a minute. They gathered in their now familiar formation. Clara at the center, 4 brothers around her, a wall of resolve and barely controlled fear. The rider resolved out of the mist. Calvin Mercer, alone. No sheriff, no Hargrove. Just a man on a horse wearing a bowler hat and a dark coat and an expression that gave away nothing at all. He dismounted with economical movements, tied his horse, walked toward the porch, stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at Stone. He looked at Colton. He looked at Clara, his gray eyes flat and unreadable as river stones in winter. Mr. Crawford, he said, addressing Stone, I have been in communication with my agency's Boston office. The pause that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt like the distance between one heartbeat and the next, a gap wide enough to fall through. Certain irregularities concerning Mr. Hargrove's past business dealings with the late Mr. Thomas Ashford have come to our attention. His voice was level, measured, each word placed with the precision of a bricklayer setting stones. The page your brother provided contained references that, when cross-referenced with publicly available patent filings and court records from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, suggest a pattern of intellectual property theft and financial fraud consistent with the charges for which Mr. Ashford was convicted. He paused, let the words settle. However, the evidence as presented also suggests that these charges may have been misdirected, that the individual responsible for the theft may not have been Mr. Ashford, but rather his business partner. Clara made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a cry. Something between the two. A sound that contained years of grief and months of fear and the sudden blinding, almost unbearable sensation of being believed. My agency has opened a formal review of the matter. I have been instructed to withdraw from my current employment and file a complete report. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency does not look kindly on clients who omit material information from their engagement contracts. Information such as accusations of fraud, patent theft, and the potential wrongful imprisonment of the very individual whose family they have hired us to locate. He turned his gaze to Clara. For the first time, something moved behind those flat gray eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition. A professional acknowledgement that the facts had led him to a conclusion he had not expected and was not entirely comfortable with, but which his integrity would not allow him to ignore. Miss Ashford, I regret any distress my investigation has caused you. My report will state that you are residing at this ranch of your own volition, that you are in no danger from the Crawford family, and that you have made serious allegations regarding Mr. Hargrove's business practices that warrant further examination. It will also include a recommendation that the Pinkerton National Detective Agency decline any future engagement from Mr. Silas Hargrove. Colton, who had been holding his breath for 3 days without fully realizing it, let it out in a long, slow exhale. A grin spread across his face. The real grin. Not the gambler's mask, but the genuine article. You are an honorable man, Mr. Mercer. I am a thorough man, Mr. Crawford. There is a difference, though the results are often similar. He tipped his bowler hat, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back, a figure of dispassionate justice vanishing into the morning mist. That same afternoon, Silas Hargrove rode to the Crawford Ranch for the last time, and he came alone. The silver at his temples was disheveled. His suit showed wrinkles and dust. The mask of charm had been discarded entirely. Burned away by rage. What remained was the true face of Silas Hargrove, the collector who had been told his prize was not for sale, the predator whose prey had grown teeth. This farce is over. His voice was stripped of honey and oil. What remained was metal. You will vacate this property by sundown. She is coming with me. Stone stepped off the porch, walked into the yard, stood beside Hargrove's horse, looking up at the man with an expression of absolute immovable calm. She is going nowhere, and neither are we. Calvin Mercer rode into the yard, the precise timing of a man who had been observing from a distance and had chosen his moment of intervention with professional care. Mr. Hargrove, my agency has been in contact with our Boston office. A formal investigation into your business practices has been opened. The patent case will be reviewed. You may have purchased a mortgage, sir, but you cannot purchase the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and you cannot purchase the truth. The color left Hargrove's face in stages, like tide water receding from a beach, revealing the barren, ugly terrain beneath. He looked at Clara. His eyes held the venom of a man who has lost something he believed he owned. She met his gaze without flinching. She was not the girl who had fled Boston in the night clutching a wicker basket and a prayer. She was something else now. Something that 3 weeks on a Montana ranch in the steady presence of 4 mountain men had forged from the raw materials of her grief and her courage. A woman standing on ground she had earned, surrounded by people who had chosen her, holding the key to her father's vindication sewn into a quilt by her mother's dying hands. She did not blink, she did not waver. She stood and she looked at the man who had destroyed her father, and she let him see in her eyes that his power over her was finished. Hargrove wrenched his horse around so violently the animal screamed and reared. He drove his heels into its flanks and galloped out of the yard, out of the valley, and out of their lives, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust in the fading echo of hoofbeats and the certain absolute knowledge that he would not be coming back. The mountain does not care, but I do, and Stone Crawford had proved it. In the days that followed, the world rearranged itself with the quiet efficiency of water finding its level. Stone rode to the bank and negotiated the mortgage back to legitimate terms. The ranch was saved. Then Stone did something that stunned every member of the household, including himself. He rode to the territorial land office and withdrew a substantial portion of the ranch's savings, money that represented years of brutal labor. Dollars and dimes accumulated through 1,000 small sacrifices. He converted the money into 3 train tickets. First class, Boston to Redstone Crossing, Montana Territory. He brought them home and laid them on the kitchen table without ceremony, the way a man lays down a winning hand. For your sisters. If they are anything like you, this ranch could use them. Clara stared at the tickets, 3 slips of paper on a rough pine table catching the late afternoon light, 3 passages from the old world to the new, 3 promises made in cardstock and ink that her family would be whole again. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes filled. She looked at Stone Crawford, this impossible man, this mountain of silence and duty who had given her 1 month and ended up giving her everything. And she saw him clearly for the first time. Not the rancher, not the protector, not the granite wall, the man. The man who had been so busy carrying everyone else that he had forgotten he was allowed to want something for himself. Stone. There is something else, he said, his voice rougher than usual. He removed his hat, and in the gesture was a vulnerability so uncharacteristic that his brothers, watching from the doorway with varying degrees of failed nonchalance, went completely still. He turned the hat in his massive hands, around and around, a man searching for words in a place where he usually kept only silence. Clara. Before you came to this place, this house was just somewhere I slept between one day's work and the next. The ranch was just a thing I kept alive because letting it die felt too much like letting my parents die a second time. I was not living here. I was maintaining a position, holding a line, getting from one sunrise to the next without losing anyone else. He stopped turning the hat. His eyes found hers. Then you stepped off that stagecoach. You were carrying a battered bag and a wicker basket and more trouble than any one person should have to carry alone. And you were terrified. I could see it in your hands, in your eyes, in the way you held your chin up even when your knees were shaking. And I thought this woman is either the bravest person I have ever met or the most foolish. And it took me about 2 days to figure out that there is no difference. Something that might have been a smile moved across the granite of his face. I have watched you turn this house into a home. I have watched you stand up to the kind of man who destroys people for sport. And you did not bend. You brought more than bread and clean floors and a garden, Clara. You brought laughter back into these walls. You brought warmth. You brought the sound of someone humming in the kitchen. And I did not even know how much I missed that sound until I heard it again. His voice dropped lower. You brought life back into this house and into me. Clara was motionless, the tears flowing freely now, but she made no move to wipe them away. I told the sheriff you were my betrothed. That was a lie. I said it to protect you. But I am standing here now, and I am not standing here to protect you. I am standing here because somewhere between the bread you baked and the stars you showed Wyatt, and the night you tried to sell yourself for our land, and the morning I tore up your letter, I fell in love with you. The words came out rough and imperfect, shaped by hands better suited to fence posts than to poetry. But they were true. And truth in the mouth of a man who has spent 6 years rationing words the way he rationed flour carries a weight that no amount of eloquence can match. I am asking you, not as a rancher who placed an advertisement because his house was falling apart, not as a man who needs someone to cook his meals and mend his shirts. I am asking you as a man who needs you. Will you marry me, Clara Ashford? Not an arrangement, not a contract, not a transaction. Will you be my wife because you choose to be? Because this place, this valley, this broken down, beautiful ranch at the edge of the world is where you belong. She looked up at him. This man, this mountain. She placed her hands against his chest, palms flat against the rough fabric of his shirt, and beneath her fingers she felt the steady thundering beat of his heart, strong and sure and fast, the heart of a man who was terrified and brave and absolutely irrevocably certain. "I came here seeking a refuge," she said, and her voice was clear and strong despite the tears. "I never dreamed I would find a home." She rose on her toes. "Yes, Stone Crawford. Yes." He drew her into his arms. The embrace was powerful and gentle, the way a man holds something precious that he came within a breath of losing. His arms closed around her. She pressed her face against his chest and felt the mountains steady beneath her, solid and warm and permanent. And the last remnants of fear dissolved like snow in spring sunlight. In the doorway, Wyatt punched the air with his fist and made a sound that was halfway between a whoop and a sob. Colton slow clapped his eyes suspiciously bright. Garrett removed his spectacles and polished them with his shirt tail, a maneuver that conveniently required him to look away from the scene just long enough to compose himself. "You belong here." Wyatt had been right, from the very beginning. That evening the door closed softly behind them, and when morning came, everything had changed between them. The first snow of the season began to fall outside the window, and inside the house was warm. The stagecoach pulled into Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks later. Otis Drummond was driving as always, and he had the particular grin of a man who was carrying cargo he considered personally entertaining. Got another delivery for the Crawfords, 3 of them this time, handled with care. Stone and Clara stood together on the platform, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on his forearm. She wore her navy dress, cleaned and pressed, and mended with its stitches smaller and neater than the originals because Clara had learned to mend better than the dressmaker who first sewed it. The cameo brooch gleamed at her throat. The stagecoach door opened. The first to emerge was Abigail, 19 years old and radiating the kind of fierce combative energy that suggested she had spent the entire journey from Boston preparing to fight someone. Her dark eyes swept the platform, took in the 4 enormous men, the mountains, the dust, the absolutely ridiculous vastness of the sky, and her chin lifted with a defiance that was so purely unmistakably Ashford that Clara laughed through her tears. Eliza came next, 17, clutching a sketchbook to her chest the way her sister had once clutched a wicker basket. Her eyes were wet and gentle, and already moving across the landscape with the particular hunger of an artist seeing a world she had never drawn. She looked at the mountains and her lips parted, and Garrett, watching from the platform, felt something in his chest shift in a way that he recognized with the calm certainty of a man who trusts his own observations as the beginning of a very important story. And finally Nora, 15, stumbling out of the coach with the graceless enthusiasm of a colt on new legs. She looked at the sky, enormous in blue and impossibly open, and her face broke into a smile of such pure, uncomplicated wonder that Wyatt, standing at the back of the group, felt his own smile return from wherever it had been hiding, flooding back into his face like sunlight into a room where the curtains had been opened. Clara made a sound that was beyond words. She broke away from Stone and ran, and the 4 Ashford sisters collided in the middle of the platform in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter, holding each other with the desperate, joyful grip of people who have been separated by fear and distance and the cruelty of a world that does not care about the bonds between sisters and who have found each other again despite everything. The 4 Crawford brothers watched from the platform. Wyatt was grinning, his smile restored and blazing. Colton tilted his hat back and shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man who has seen the cards fall in a way he did not expect and is genuinely pleased by the result. Garrett stood with his hands in his pockets, his eyes soft, watching the sisters already composing in his mind the story he would tell about this day. And Stone, the eldest, the anchor, the wall, the man who had carried his family on his shoulders for 6 years and had just made room for 4 more. He allowed himself the rarest expression in his limited repertoire. He smiled, a full, genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes and softened the granite and revealed for anyone who cared to look the man beneath the mountain. Built this with our own hands, starting today. That evening, 8 people sat around a kitchen table built for 4. Elbows bumped, plates passed hand to hand. The food was simple: bread and stew and wild berry pie. but it was eaten with an appetite that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the particular irreplaceable nourishment of sitting at a table where you are wanted. The memory quilt finished at last by Clara and Eliza working together over the long spring evenings, hung on the wall above the fireplace. The dark blues and grays glowed in the lamplight, and the tiny coded stitches that held a dead woman's truth were still there on the backing, invisible unless you knew where to look. But the quilt was no longer a relic of sorrow. It was a testament to Thomas Ashford, who had trusted the world and been betrayed, to Margaret Ashford, who had loved her husband enough to sew his vindication into the fabric of their lives, to Clara, who had carried it across a continent and used it to save a family that was not yet her own. We will get through this. They had. Together. Autumn 1908. Stone Crawford was 60 years old now, slower. His back ached on cold mornings. His hands were still calloused, still strong, still capable of splitting a cord of wood before breakfast, though Wyatt told him every week to let the younger men handle it. His hair had gone silver at the temples the same way his father's had. His jaw was still square. His eyes were still amber. But the granite had softened long ago. Worn smooth not by weather but by love and time and the accumulated warmth of 30 years of someone humming in his kitchen. Clara was 52. Her honey blonde hair was threaded with silver now. Her cornflower blue eyes were still bright, perhaps brighter because 30 years of living had added a depth that youth could not possess. She was still small. 5 feet 3 inches would never change. Her hands were still deft. She baked bread every morning, the garden still bloomed, the house was still home. The Crawford Ashford Ranch had tripled in size. Hundreds of head of cattle. The main house expanded with rooms for a growing family. New barns, strong fences, the memory quilt hanging above the fireplace, its coated backing, a family secret known only to those who had been there the night it revealed its truth. Autumn afternoon, Stone sat on the porch chair he had built 30 years ago. White oak, mortise and tenon joints. Built to last another 30 years. Clara sat beside him, her hand on his forearm, where her hand always rested. On the yard below, 4 grandchildren chased each other through the wildflowers. The eldest, a boy of 10 with amber eyes and a height that already surpassed his classmates by a full head, looked so much like Stone that Clara had to turn away each time she saw him running. The youngest, a girl of 4 with blonde hair and blue eyes, looked so much like Clara that Stone had to stop and stare each time she laughed. Wyatt, 50 now, still smiling, the smile Montana had never managed to take, was teaching the oldest grandson to ride. Colton, 55, his hair silver, but his eyes still carrying that perpetual flicker of mischief, was losing at poker to Abigail, as usual. Garrett and Eliza sat on the back porch reading together as they had done every evening for 27 years. The news from Boston had come years ago. The Pinkerton investigation had led to Thomas Ashford's solicitor, Old Mister Pemberton, who had kept the original documents in an iron safe for years, because he was the kind of man who could not turn his back on injustice even when turning his back was safer. Silas Hargrove had been prosecuted and convicted. Thomas Ashford's name had been cleared, the patent restored to the family, a small fortune in royalties, enough to pay off the mortgage forever, enough to buy more land, enough to build. Stone had brought Thomas Ashford's remains home from Massachusetts, buried him beside the elder Crawfords under the old cottonwood tree, where the leaves rustled in the wind like whispered conversation. 2 Crawford graves and 1 Ashford grave. 3 people who never met in life, but whose children had built something together that none of them alone could have imagined. Do you remember the first day Clara asked watching the sunset? The sky was changing the way it always changed in Montana. Gold to rose to purple to the vast stars scattered darkness. The way it had changed every evening for 30 years, and she had never tired of watching. I remember, Stone said, his voice still deep, still rough, but warm. Warm in the way that only 30 years with someone can make a voice warm. You stepped off that stagecoach not much taller than the wicker basket you were carrying. Clara laughed, the laugh that still transformed her, that still moved across her face like sunlight through clouds. And you stood there looking like a mountain that had decided to grow legs. You were scared, terrified, she said, echoing the word he had spoken on this very porch 30 years before. But the mountain has not swallowed me yet, not yet. Silence, wind through the meadow grass, the laughter of grandchildren. The smell of bread from the kitchen where Nora was baking today, using Clara's recipe, using flour that 30 years ago, had been a finite resource and was now as abundant as the love in this house. Stone took Clara's hand. His hand, large and calloused and scarred, closed around hers, small and warm and still fitting perfectly after 30 years. Like holding a sparrow. The first time he had thought that was on the stagecoach platform, and every time he held her hand since. "You belong here," he said. The sentence Wyatt had spoken first all those years ago, sitting on a fence rail at sunset, saying it the way he said everything naturally without thinking, like stating a fact about the weather. The sentence Stone now said every day, not in words always, but in action, in silence, in 30 years of morning coffee and split wood and checking the door before bed and standing between his family and the world. A man keeps his word. And Stone Crawford had kept every word. Clara looked out over the land they had built together. The mountains ring the valley like a crown. The same mountains, unchanged, unmoved. The way they had stood for 10,000 years and would stand for 10,000 more, permanent. Like stone, like the love between them. She still remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just 4 bearded mountain men and 100 miles of wilderness. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. The truth was more beautiful than any promise could have been. 30 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through wildflowers that bloomed every spring. Without fail, she thought this. That was the day my life began. And beside her, the mountain still stood, still keeping his word. Winter always ends, but some things endure. The laughter of grandchildren drifted through the open windows and out into the Montana evening, carrying with it the sound of a family that had found its way improbably and against all odds home.